So this is the last of the 4 critical lectures that I have been talking about that are the real, I think, core of sustainable design as I'm thinking right now about dealing with carbon. The first was the radical efficiency, where I made the case for passive house and very efficient buildings that we have to do all of this right now. The second was radical decarbonization, which was 2 parts. The first, which was the embodied carbon, the upfront carbon from building, why we should be using natural materials. And the second part was the elimination of fossil fuels and getting off gas, basically electrifying everything. The third, which was last week, which was radical sufficiency, which I thought was 2 weeks ago, excuse me, one of the most important things about how much do you need? What is the right approach? Should you use a bicycle instead of a car? Should you use a clothesline instead of a dryer? And just sort of making your life a little smaller in that sense. Now, as you know, I've been trying to do this 1.5 degree lifestyle that I was originally going to inflict on all of you, and I'm glad I didn't, because it's really, really hard. The idea, which I divided up, the 2.5 tons of carbon we're supposed to emit in a year, and that comes down to 6.8 kilograms a day. And I've realized a couple of things in doing this. I'll talk about this for a moment, that it's really much easier when you live like I do. I work from home. I don't have to drive anywhere. I've got my small house already because I subdivided it. I picked my house in a streetcar suburb, so I don't have to drive anywhere. I bought a fancy electric bike that you can see at the back of the classroom there. It becomes much easier when you can set up your life to do that way. All of the little things almost didn't matter as much. What it came down to was transportation and red meat, and a few other minor things. I found out when I left the last class, I went straight to the airport, got in a plane, flew to New York, spent the day in New York, came back. I ate up, in that 36 hours, I ate up a month's worth of carbon. It just blew me right out of the ballpark. But what was I going to say to my new boss? No, I'm not going to come and see you in New York. It's too much carbon. If I hadn't been teaching on Tuesday, then I would have taken the train, as I've sometimes done, on Monday and had the whole day in. But I had no choice. I had to leave here. I got in late. I took a cab. My plane back on Thursday morning last week, on Thursday morning, was really early, so I took a cab. It was like a giant SUV. It took up an entire day's worth of carbon just getting from downtown to LaGuardia. So, it's really hard. Yesterday was my daughter's birthday, and my son-in-law is a really good cook, and they invited us to their apartment, and what were they serving? Serving an absolutely beautiful steak. So I had steak for dinner, and basically just dinner was 1.5 days worth of carbon on my allowance. It's really hard, and the lesson I learned is what's really important are the big things, that measuring every little bit of milk that goes into my coffee cup isn't important. Not driving, not eating red meat, living in a smaller space, these are the things that are important. And I'll be explaining the results of my experiment in greater detail. That was all about sufficiency. Today, it's about simplicity, and this is very much a design story. You all know the story of Mies van der Rohe's great quote, which is, "Less is more." And the Venturis didn't like that very much. It wasn't very exciting, so they turned it around and said, "Less is a bore." And this wonderful architect, Morris Lapidus, who designed all the fabulous hotels in Florida, he turned it on its head and said, "No, I'm sorry, too much is never enough." And he designed the Fontainebleau that you see behind Frank Sinatra here, and he designed So this is like the Americana, one of his hotels, with all those projecting balconies. And what that hotel always reminded me of was this building in Vancouver designed by Bjarke Ingels. Who here has heard of Bjarke? Anybody design people? He's very famous doing all of these buildings. He's the rock star of architecture right now. But his buildings, you know, are all like this one. You know, too much is never enough. I met him actually in Copenhagen when I was in there for an event and visited his office. Lovely, gorgeous office in a former place where they made bottle caps for Carlsberg beer. And there was this model. There was this model of a building to be built in New York that I saw in his office, and I just thought, this is crazy. Nobody could build this thing. Water is going to be pouring down the top of the building into all of those balconies. Everyone's going to have a drain. This is just one of the dumbest things you could possibly think of. They'll never build this. It's just an idea. You know, why would anyone do something so complicated and silly? And there it is in New York. Very famous. Everyone loves looking at it. It's exactly like the model. Everything, even the bricks inside are like the jogs outside, you know, it's just that kind of, all of his detail, you know, why make anything flat when you can jog it and use more material? And the problem with this is that when you look at this building, it's now finished. When you look at every detail of it, before I was a writer, I was actually a real estate developer. After I was an architect, I became a developer and did a building where I had one apartment which had a balcony that was on top of another unit. And some window cleaners threw a line over the handrail. The handrail pulled in a little bit. The handrail broke the roof membrane. The next time it rained, there was $16,000 worth of damage in the unit below. And another developer said, well, this is always a problem whenever you put balconies on top of finished space. And what does Bjarke do? He makes every single unit a balcony on top of finished space. So that every unit, instead of having one window wall in the end, it has how many surfaces? It has like the top and the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4 surfaces. Then you go to his wonderful incinerator. It's called a waste-to-energy plant with the ski slopes on top. It's got all of this cladding on the outside. And it's very beautiful. These are like giant 3-meter-long bricks, as he calls them. But they're sort of stuck on the outside, and they've got these troughs on top, and water is supposed to flow from one to the other, to the other, to the other, over the whole building. And you just think, how crazy is this in a wet country? And then finally, there's this fabulous marine museum he built up in Elsinore, north of Copenhagen. And it's inside what used to be the dry docks where they would fix Navy ships. And the Navy ships, they don't have anymore. And they came to Bjarke and said, we want you to build a museum in the dry dock here. And he said, are you crazy? No, I'm going to build it outside the dry dock, underground, around the dry dock. And the dry dock will just be an open space with these bridges going across. And I went on these walkways. You know, he likes things shiny. So the walkway was made of these aluminum panels, which I thought, these are going to be a complete death trap. They were so badly installed that when I first saw them in 2016, you could see here they were all warping and bending, and they were like trying to stick a couple of screws in them to hold it together. The whole thing you could see was a disaster happening. And sure enough, when I went back 2 years later, so I was going every 2 years to cover a particular design exhibition that was happening, they were rebuilding the whole thing and putting a surface where you weren't going to break your neck and which had proper drainage. So my point is, it's wonderful to do architecture like this, but it's really expensive and it's really complicated. I wrote all this whole thing up, by the way, as a post on TreeHugger this morning. And in the post, I basically said that when I was an architect, you tried to do things simply in ways people had done them before, so you don't get sued. When you're an architect, you always get sued. When I became a developer, I said, well, you want to keep things simple and do them the way everything else, so you don't get sued and so you don't go broke. And both of those happened to me. So, you've got to think about these things, and now this is what Bjarke is proposing for Toronto, for King Street, King and Bathurst area, where when I was an architect, I actually renovated this building. There will be nothing left of it but the facade. And then behind it, he's building this giant mountain of these units like this. And again, it's going to be that issue, that every single ceiling becomes a floor, becomes a balcony, becomes habitable space. He's got trees on them. It's beautiful, it's wonderful, it's selling like hotcakes, very, very expensive. And everybody who's in there is going to have troubles for the rest of their lives, just because that's what happens when you build this way. And, this is why I talk about what we need is simplicity, to think about in advance the problems that come from making things complicated. There's also an issue of cost. All of those units in the Vancouver building and in the Toronto building cost twice as much as conventional units because they cost twice as much to build. And because they're so spectacular, people are actually signing up to buy them. But if we've got a housing problem and a carbon problem, which we do, what do we have to do to address both of these? We have to reduce the cost, and we have to reduce the amount of materials that go into them. And that's why I fell in love with this presentation by an engineer in the UK called Nick Grant. Nick Grant, I saw him when I was at a Passive House conference in Munich in 2018, where he talked about how you design properly. Like, you get in at the beginning and decide what you really want to do to build it properly. You decide, let's do it as simple as possible, and you make the changes at the beginning, because the longer you leave it, the more expensive everything gets. And this is what's known in the trade as value engineering, which when I was in business were the two ugliest words in the entire business, because it meant you've done your design, these people come in and they just strip everything out of it to reduce the cost. And you're left with a shell of what you thought was the design. And so, it's just, they were two words I always hated. And Nick Grant showed me, no, if I come in at the beginning and I tell you, let's keep things simple. Let's use fixed glazing plus a little ventilation and save money. Let's use different kinds of roofs. Let's not have all the jogs and the push-ins and the push-outs and the bumps that you normally have in these things. And keep it simple and figure it out up front. So a lot of people have complained, well, this doesn't look like much. But in fact, what it is, it's a house that a guy built to the Passive House standard that normally costs 20% more than a conventional building, and it actually costs less, yet it was built to the standard. Now, in Toronto, for years, we had all these glass condos, and it was very simple. You build a box and you cover it in glass. And then 3 years ago, the Ontario Building Code was changed to where you couldn't have that much glass anymore. And all of a sudden, the architects didn't know what to do because it wasn't so simple anymore. So, and the architect here is actually an old friend of mine. He started saying, well, we have to make it more colorful. We'll put in different materials. We'll push things and we'll pull things and give it some variety. And this one right near where I live, I mean, there's so much going on in terms of materials and levels. And every time you make those changes, of course, it adds costs and it adds problems and it adds possibilities of things leaking. And what was it called? A woman who follows me on Twitter just yesterday was tweeting about another building like this, and she called it like the sample room way of designing. You know, every architect and design office has a sample room where you have all the different materials. She was just saying, you just go into the sample room and you grab everything and you just put it on and do a pastiche of the sample room. So like this, she called it, I think, sample room architecture. And even, like, this is a passive house in, with the first passive house apartment building in Canada. And the architect, who I really like, you know, the problem in passive houses, the windows generally are smaller because they're really expensive. And even the world's best window isn't as good as a lousy wall when it comes to the value of insulation and that. And so when the windows got smaller, the architects start thinking, well, what do I do? And so they start doing all of these. So you've got a mixture of brick, you've got a mixture of gray, you've got a mixture of yellow panels under the window. It all becomes really busy because when you're sitting and looking at the drawing, it just looks flat with a couple of holes in it. So we keep adding things. When I was an architect, I used to do this, you know, because you're not seeing it in the way it is. Now, a friend of mine, an architect, Mike Eliazon, put it another way, said that we should be designing dumb boxes, basically keeping it simple and keeping it dumb. And dumb boxes are the least expensive, the least carbon intensive, the most resilient, and have some of the lowest operational costs compared to a more varied and intensive massing. And some of the best passive houses were designed this way. This is a single family house in Maine where they've got really, really difficult cold winters. So you make it just a simple box because every job is more insulation and more problems and more thermal bridges. And you just do it all with simple materials and nice proportions. And the same architect doing this. Simple forms are the easiest ones to detail. They enclose the most area, which gives you the nice forms, but good insulation, passive house quality. I really liked this project. In Philadelphia, the standard house design really is a very simple, dumb box. You can see the three houses on the end. So the developer building new houses there, really the whole pattern was already in sort of simple, dumb boxes. So he just carried it on. And basically was able to do these things. When I first saw them, I thought, well, these are really not very attractive. They're so simple. But when you see them in the context of everything around them, they fit absolutely perfectly. They were simple, dumb boxes, extremely efficient, extremely affordable. When you go and you start, and it's not just single family houses, this is absolutely true with multifamily. If you, in my 2 passive house conferences I've gone to in Vienna and in Munich, I saw all kinds of buildings where they just say, you know, this is a simple building, we're going to do a nice pattern of punched holes that are the windows. Compare this to that one in Vancouver again, and you see, you know, that's just a white wall with some holes in it. It's not such a big deal. And they're beautiful buildings that they build to passive house standards. Here you see again, white walls with holes in them. It's not so hard, but when you look at that on a drawing, you say, what the hell is that? It's a flat piece of paper with some squares on it, you know? You have to see enough of them to understand it. In Munich, this was the absolute pattern. Simple boxes, simple forms, design, nice patterns of windows in it, and call it a day. This one happened to have these crazy bridges connecting them, which, you know, probably blew all the economics out of it, but it made it interesting. Across the street were these small buildings like this, very simple forms. I thought they were gorgeous. And they're all because of that, because they're just boxes. They can be covered with a lot of insulation, cover that with plaster, and you've got a building. And that's essentially how they build. Yes?
I was just wondering why, just to kind of give it some variation, like why they did some kind of like flat pattern or something more on the walls. Like either putting like some kind of thin material.
I could show you a building a block away from here that's the ugliest building I've ever seen that's not included in this slideshow, but that's exactly that. I'll show it next week. These, you know, they bring in different colors and different patterns of balconies. There's variety in all the different buildings. They're not identical, and yet conceptually, they're simple, dumb boxes with punched windows. And they're lovely. Here are some that are a little more complicated, that what they did was that they took the simple box And because they were going to have balconies and circulation, they built it all outside the building in sort of all of this galvanized steel. So it doesn't look so simple, and yet basically the building behind it is a dumb box. They clipped the balconies on, and they made them all with all of this detail so that they made the outside more complex without changing the idea that the building behind is very simple. And so these have a layer of complexity laid on top of the simple dumb box. This is a building in Berlin that I went to specifically. It's a co-op housing building where everybody owns a piece of it together, and it couldn't have been any simpler. And they just outside clipped on some galvanized balconies and chain link fencing. That's it, chain link fencing like you find on a schoolyard. They made the balconies of it, detailed it nicely, and I think it came out beautifully. Okay, that's the end of part one. Let's start part two.